Hello, Year 8. Welcome to lesson one of your new unit of work on a revolution connected to the French Revolution. So, over the last couple of weeks, you were studying the major changes created in France as a result of the French Revolution. And you learn about some of the key figures, the people involved, like Louis and Robespierre. Now what we're going to do is we're going to broaden our study of the 18th century, which is the century in which the French Revolution took place, to look at another major event um, in that final decade of the 18th century. But first we're going to start by trying a little odd one out task. So there are four people in front of you, as you can see here. I want you firstly just to have a look at these four uh, images of statues, and I'm going to give you a chance to work out what these four people might have in common, and then after that, try to work out who you think the odd one out might be. So just pause it and then have a think, maybe discuss with someone if you're by them, and then press play again. Okay, so now you've restarted the video tutorial. I'll just give you an example of what some other students in the past have said in response to these two questions. So when they look at these four individuals, these statues, they think that what they might have in common is that they're all important people in history, significant people. The reason why they might say that is because, well, they have statues. There are great big statues of them, looking very fine and noble. Um, Odd one out is a bit trickier, but some people look at the poses and realize that, well, the guy in the bottom right seems to have a sword. He's the only one. There's another fellow there with a book, and what does that say about him? So yeah, there are lots of things you can think about just by looking at these statues without knowing who they are. And I'm sure many of you know who the one in the top right is anyway, but we'll go through them all individually now. What I also want you to do at this stage is to open up the Word document. You can see here that the four names of the people that you saw on that first slide, and you're just going to take down some key details about them as I talk you through them. So the first one was the man on the bottom left. His name was the Abbe Gregoire, and he is, of course, very much connected with our last work on the French Revolution. He was a French Catholic priest, a leader during the French Revolution. He's most famous for being an abolitionist, and that's a really important word that we need to um, understand throughout this unit. So, an abolitionist is someone who believes fervently, really strongly in ending slavery and the slave trade. So the Abbe Gregoire created a group of people called an organization called the Society of the Friends of the Blacks in France in the 1770s. And they fought to abolish slavery within the French Empire. And this is one of his most famous quotes on that subject, where he said, "Mortals, as in people, are equal, and it is not birth but virtue. They're good works, they're good deeds that makes the difference." Okay, so just maybe getting the quote down or something important about the Abbe Gregoire. The next one is probably the most famous of the four, and his name is Abraham Lincoln. He lived in the 19th century, and he's most famous for leading America through their Civil War that took place in the 1860s. And within that, he's most well remembered for ending the practice of slavery in America, which had been the major reason for that Civil War starting in the first place. So you might want to jot down that bit that I've underlined there. He passed the 13th Amendment, which is a law which made slavery illegal in America. This is one of my favorite sources about Abraham Lincoln. It shows him in a fictional scene. It's not real, but it's supposed to make you understand what kind of a person he was or how people at the time understood him. And it's an image showing how Africans perceived him or other people in America, his admirers, people that liked Abraham Lincoln, perceived him. So I'm going to pause now whilst you write a brief answer to that question, which is, what does this painting suggest about how African slaves got their freedom? Brilliant. So you should have written about 2 or 3 sentences on that. Some answers that people have given in the past is, from this source, it looks like the Africans were just given their freedom by whites, and they were grateful for it. And we know this because the enslaved African there, or formerly enslaved African, is bowing before Abraham Lincoln, kissing his hand. And so that's a very clear interpretation about who was responsible for ending slavery in America. We know Abraham Lincoln signed the law, but what other people perhaps played a part, this is something that we need to start thinking about throughout this unit, because we're going to be considering issues of interpretations. Now, you'll know that interpretations are how we understand what happened in the past. It's the how we appreciate all the different stories about events in the past, and which ones we think are more valid than others. The next one, you can take a few notes on him, is the most famous British abolitionist, and his name is William Wilberforce, and he was a major player in the campaign to end slavery in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. So you can jot down some of the key details about him there. And as we saw, that was his statue, a very famous statue, currently in Westminster Abbey in London. And the inscription at the very bottom there ends by saying that his name, William Wilberforce's name, will ever be specially identified with those whose work, which by the blessing of God removed from England the guilt of the African slave trade. So there's a very interesting interpretation there about William Wilberforce and what he achieved. Now I'm going to pause again to give you a chance to answer this question, which is, now reading that epitaph, that little quote at the bottom of his statue, who does it suggest was responsible for giving enslaved Africans their freedom? All right. So many students before in the past have looked at that quote and said, well, based on that quote, a bit like Abraham Lincoln, it looked very much like the slaves were granted their freedom by powerful people in politics, and perhaps they weren't given a great deal of credit for ending it themselves. And then on finally to the fourth figure in our lesson study here. I'm going to tell you a great deal about him, but pause the video again. I want you just to jot down these two, your responses to these 2 questions. First one is, where do you think this statue may be? Okay, have a look at the background, maybe the appearance of the man on the plinth there. And secondly, why do you think he might be famous? Why do you think he might be historically important, significant? That's a key focus for what we're going to look at over this unit. Okay, so just pause the video and answer those questions. Very good. So some students in the past have said that this statue might be in Africa, and reasons for saying that is because he looks African. You can see there his features are African features. The background as well, it doesn't look like it's in Europe. There are sort of, it looks tropical almost, from the trees and then the sky. Right, what I want you now to do is to open up the video file on the Teams folder and then play the video that's labeled number 1. and then answer that question, where is the statue, and also write down any other important details in your book. Okay, so pause this and play that. Go. Okay, so the statue was located in Haiti. Haiti, some of you might know, is in the Caribbean. It's a very small, well, it's actually half of an island. So it's to the south of the United States, as you can see there in the top right corner of the map. It is east of Jamaica, slightly larger island. It shares the island with another country, the Dominican Republic. Haiti in the 18th century used to go by another name, and that was Saint Domingue. That was the French name for the island when it was part of their empire. There are about 10 million people there today. And the statue of that man, Toussaint Louverture, is located outside the most important building in Haiti, their national parliament building, and that's in their capital city of Port-au-Prince. And we know, that when you put a statue of someone outside a parliament building, that it's a real big statement. It's saying something about that person, that they are historically important. For example, there's a statue outside the British Parliament of Winston Churchill, who a couple of years ago was voted the most important British person to have ever lived. And that's not an uncommon opinion. So it does really say something about who that person was and why they might be important. Okay, now same thing again. I want you to pause this video and then open up video number 2. This will tell you a little bit more about Toussaint Louverture. And then while you're watching that, I want you to write down 3 things that Toussaint achieved. And then secondly, what does this suggest about how Africans got their freedom? Now we know the 2 other figures, William Wilberforce and Abraham Lincoln. There's a very clear interpretation about their role in ending slavery and how they've been seen to have played a very, very large role. Well, what does this tell us about how Africans got their freedom? Who was most responsible for it? Okay, you should have done that. All right, moving to the end of the lesson now. We've learned a great deal about this small place in the Caribbean, but also we're starting to get an idea about what this big event that we've been introduced to today might have been, the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave rebellion in history, in the history of humanity, which is a great deal. It's a huge event when you look at it in that context. Even the great Roman slave Spartacus, his rebellion failed, and he was killed by the Romans. And since then, every other slave rebellion has been eventually put down. And yet this one, in the late 18th and early 19th century, in this part of the corner of the French Empire, was successful. And who led this successful rebellion, and why should we remember them, is what we want to understand over the course of this unit. So if you would like to, just jot down a few more details about Toussaint and why you might find him remarkable. Now this is an interpretation. It's a history book. It was called The World Atlas of Revolutions. It was published in the 1980s. And I remember coming across this and being really, really shocked. So this is supposed to be a definitive, detailed list of all of the major revolutions in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. And yet there's a glaring omission. There's something missing there. So I want you to have a look what could be missing and why. So, of course, the Haitian Revolution of 1792 to 1804 is absent from this list. They have revolutions which perhaps today many people might say are not that important. So, just think and maybe jot down in your books why you think Andrew Wheatcroft, the author of this book of revolutions, chose to ignore the Haitian Revolution.